that justice would be done in this case. That prayer was answered on September 11th, 2003, when you were reunited with your family. Ultimately, no one can give you back the lost time. My hope is that in the years ahead, many good things will happen for you and your loved ones, and that something positive will come from this incredible tragedy. When I testified in court, I honestly believed you were my assailant. I was wrong. I cannot ask for, nor do I deserve your forgiveness. I can only say to you, in deepest humility, how profoundly sorry I am. May you be richly blessed, and may each day be a celebration of a new and better life. And when I finished writing that letter, the song, the refrain from the familiar Simon & Garfunkel song went through my head, Homeward Bound. And all my words come back at me in shades of mediocrity. How do you possibly apologize to someone for playing a role in depriving them of 18 years of their life? The most difficult person to forgive in all this, obviously, is myself. But also, not a day goes by that I don't think of Gregory Allen's other victims. Between 1985, when I was assaulted and misidentified my assailant, and 1995, when Gregory Allen was finally convicted of the brutal rape of a woman in Green Bay, he suspected of or was charged with 8 to 10 crimes, again, of a sexual nature. So how many other women have their lives turned inside out and upside down because of this horrendous failure of the justice system? Because of the guilt I feel, I had to learn a new way of living with myself. But Stephen Avery's task was much greater. He has had to learn an entirely new way of living. I would be presumptuous to assume that I have any understanding whatsoever of what he went through, either emotionally or physically, during those years in prison. But I can tell you some of the things that happened. His wife divorced him. The 2 sons, who were just 6 days old, twins, 6 days old when he was arrested, didn't want to have anything to do with him. His grandmother and a nephew both died while he was in prison, and he was particularly close to his grandmother. She had helped raise him, and he was not able to attend his funeral, her funeral, or the funeral of his nephew. And his relationship with his family upon his release was very strained. This is often the case with exonerees. What Stephen shared with reporters was that for 18 years he was told how to spend every minute of every day when he was in prison. And when he got out, his family, with the best of intentions, offered advice on how he should put his life back together. And he needed time and he needed space. And he was so uncomfortable living at home that he ended up living in an ice fishing shanty on his sister's property. And he said it felt comfortable because it was about the size of his cell. It's these sorts of things, the little things, that I didn't think about until I had the privilege of hearing exonerees share their experiences. But it's the million little things. I've had exonerees say to me, I walk up to a door and I wait for it to open. Because in prison, you don't open the doors. They slide open when the guard decides to open them. On February 22nd, I had an opportunity to apologize in person to Stephen Avery and to his parents. It was February 22nd, 2004. It's the story with which I began my remarks tonight. I was asked to testify in front of the Stephen Avery Task Force. The state of Wisconsin had put together a task force. And I said to my attorney, who also was her name is Janine Geske. She's a retired Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice and a Marquette Law School professor. And she moderated the restorative justice programs that I participated in the state of Wisconsin. So we were good friends, and she was guiding me through this process. And I called her and I said, I'm testifying next Tuesday. I just got a call from Keith Finley from the Wisconsin Innocence Project. Steve's going to be there with his parents. I need to apologize in person before I walk into a public hearing with media and cameras present. And Janine said to me, I know you're an emotional person, you won't be able to get through this. And I said, I know me better, I am an emotional person, but I won't be able to get through a news conference if I have not apologized in person to Stephen Avery. So we were able to meet in a legislator's office before I testified. This was the victim offender dialogue I wanted to have in 1987, only at this point I'm considering myself the offender and Steve the victim. And ordinarily, in a restorative justice process, a victim offender dialogue, there are many pre-meetings ahead of time with the individual parties. We did not have time for that because we only had 4 days. So Steve was represented, or he had Keith Finley there from the Wisconsin Innocence Project, his attorney as a support person, and I had a victim advocate from the Department of Justice there as a support person for me. And Steve walked into the room. I was never so nervous in my whole life. I almost wanted him to come in and holler and scream at me because it would have been easier than accepting his grace and his forgiveness. But we were in a small room. I'm there first. He walks in, I stand up, extend my hand, and he gives me this hearty handshake and sits down and looks totally relaxed, like we're going to discuss the Green Bay Packers versus the Chicago Bears. And Steve is a very soft-spoken person, so it was not ideal. There wasn't much of a dialogue. I did most of the talking. But fortunately, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel had published an article. They had interviewed Steve, and he had described what his first 5 months had been like, 4 or 5 months since he was released. And so I had some idea of some things that I could discuss with him. And we talked about how difficult it was for him to go through a divorce, how his kids didn't want to have anything to do with him, how awful it was, especially on holidays, etc. So at first I met with Steve, and then I asked if his parents would be interested. I said, I would love to apologize to your parents, but I understand if they don't even want to be in the same room with me. And Steve said, I think my mother would be okay, but I'm not sure about my dad. He's pretty bitter. And then he apologized for his dad's bitterness. And I said, Steve, I have a grown son. If someone accused my son of doing to a woman what I accused you of doing to me, and I knew my son was innocent, I would be bitter. I would be concerned if your dad didn't have some bitterness. It is totally understandable. It's nothing to apologize for. And his parents, bless their heart, agreed to come into the room and hear what I had to say. They are even more soft-spoken than Steve, at least they were in this setting. His father also has a pretty severe hearing loss, so I'm not sure how much he heard, but pretty much I repeated to them what I had said to Steve. And I also said to them, I'm going to testify today, but I've prepared a written statement. My attorney can't be here. She doesn't want me to deviate from this statement. So I'm not going to take questions from the media, but if you ever have any questions of me, you can contact me, and I would be happy to sit down and we can discuss what happened. And I said to his mother and father, do you have any questions of me now? And his mother shrugged and said, there's really not much to say, which I think pretty much summed up where she was at that moment, and I think was a very honest statement. And again, I have a huge amount of respect for them for even agreeing to come into the room and hear what I had to say. At the end of our meeting, when it was time for me to testify, I went over to Steve, and I said to him, Steve, can I give you a hug? And he didn't even wait for an answer. He gives me a big bear hug. And I whispered so only he could hear, Steve, I am so sorry. And he said, it's okay, Penny, it's over. I knew it wasn't over, but that was a very generous statement on his part. I think ultimately it's what launched me on my healing journey. But how does one continue to heal after joining a small group of survivors who misidentified their assailants, a group in which I never wanted membership? Part of my journey involved talking to a woman named Jennifer Thompson. Some of you may know her as Jennifer Thompson Canino. She wrote a book called Picking Cotton. She had misidentified her assailant, whose name was Ronald Cotton. He was eventually exonerated. The two of them have become very good friends and have written a book together called Picking Cotton. And she came up with the title, which I think is brilliant. She talked about picking Ronald Cotton out of the lineup, but then also picking Ronald Cotton as her friend. And if you ever have an opportunity to hear Jennifer, don't miss it. She is phenomenal. I was given her name by Keith Finley from the Innocence Project. This was before she had written her book. And about 4 months after Steve's exoneration, I finally got up the courage to call her. And it was a cold call. She didn't know I had her name. She has triplets. They were in middle school at the time. I could hear them in the background. There aren't enough superlatives in the English language to describe Jennifer or sufficient ways to thank her for the incredible reassurances she gave me. By the time we got off the phone, she had shared so many helpful things that I felt human for the first time in a long time. And I finally understood, at least intellectually, that Stephen Avery was not my assailant, even though it was his face that I continued to see in my nightmares. However, it wasn't until I had an opportunity to pay it forward, as the expression goes, that I truly got it. As your professor mentioned, I volunteer at Northwestern University Center on Wrongful Convictions. I moved to Illinois 9 years ago, and I've been volunteering there about 6 or 7 or 8 years, I guess. And 2 of their attorneys, Karen Daniel, who spoke here a couple weeks ago, and Jean Raley, talked to me about one of their cases. There was a woman whose throat was slashed, and they were concerned that she had misidentified her assailant. And so we brainstormed about ways to approach June. Well, as it turned out, the media got to June before her attorneys did. She gets a call from, I think it might have been Maurice Posley, formerly from the Tribune, saying that the Center on Wrongful Convictions had agreed to represent the man she had misidentified. So she calls the center in tears. Jim Raley calls me and says, "Can you call June?" So I called June almost immediately after she heard this news, and she was completely dismayed. She was in tears. She was coming unglued, just as I had. And I reminded June of everything Jennifer had said to me. Excuse me. That what happened wasn't her fault, that it was the police's responsibility, not the victim's, to investigate the crime, that she had done her best under traumatic circumstances. I mean, this woman had her throat slashed, and she actually walked from the bus stop where it happened back to the hospital where she was a nurse. She was, very seriously injured. I acknowledged that she couldn't give back the exonerated man the years that he lost. But I also said that never forgiving herself wouldn't serve either of them well. And that's when the light bulb went on. It was like, I would never judge June the way I've been judging myself. I would never judge any other person. And I concluded that the fact that I made a horrible mistake did not make me a horrible person. It made me human. And how does the state heal following a horrendous miscarriage of justice? And I'm pleased to share with you that the state of Wisconsin took some very proactive steps, I believe. Excuse me a minute. Again, at the urging of, I mentioned the Manitowoc County District Attorney, the Attorney General conducted an investigation into what had gone wrong. It's interesting though, I'm grateful that Peg Laumschlager, who was the Attorney General at the time, conducted this investigation, but it was as if they had all these findings of things that had gone wrong, and then the conclusion was, but nobody's liable. There really wasn't anything too terribly wrong. You just all need to talk to each other, which we do need to do. One of the findings was that the 2 jurisdictions, the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department, need to work together. But basically the conclusion was, well, this is pre-DNA, these things happen. But let me tell you some of the things, some of the reasons why there should not have been a wrongful conviction. The victim witness coordinator and one of the paralegals in the DA's office, shortly after Stephen Avery was arrested, said to the district attorney, "We think you need to look at Gregory Allen. This is more his MO. He's much more violent than Steve. He's much closer in height," to the description that Penny gave. And also, remember I told you about the leather jacket? And how I had kind of focused on that, thinking, okay, he told me he has a knife. Where does he have the knife? Pockets look shallow, it can't be a very big knife, yada yada. At any rate, the detectives at the sheriff department actually put together a leather jacket lineup. So I go down to the sheriff's department, there's a number of tables, like the ones in this room, covered with maybe 12 to 15 leather jackets. Stephen Avery owned one leather jacket, which he said that he almost never wore. He gave it to the police. His uncle, who was a sheriff's deputy, said, I've never seen Steve wear this jacket, and I see Steve at least once a week when the family gets together. But miraculously, Judy Dvorak and the sheriff have a memory of Stephen Avery being stopped for some sort of violation, and whoa, he was wearing the leather jacket that just miraculously matched the description I gave of my assailant's leather jacket. So I look at these leather jackets. It's not there. The jacket my assailant is wearing is not there. I probably spent more time looking at his jacket than I did looking at his face. So I said, his jacket's not there. This should have generated a report, which should have gone in Stephen Avery's file, and should have been turned over during discovery because it's exculpatory evidence. I don't know if a report was ever generated, but none was ever turned over to his defense counsel. Also, Gregory Allen, who, the actual assailant, and maybe I already said this, he was not on probation at the time that I was assaulted. That's what the sheriff told me. He said, yeah, Gregory Allen's, this guy's on probation, he couldn't have been your assailant. He was with his probation officer. He wasn't even on probation. So the the Attorney General does this investigation but comes up with these really crazy conclusions that there was no wrongdoing. However, a very conservative state legislator put together the Stephen Avery Task Force, which was, and it's interesting, this guy is really right-wing. But if you think about it, he said, I'm a law and order guy. If we're going to put people away and throw the book at them, we darn well better make sure we are putting the right people behind bars. So the task force was really composed of very liberal, very conservative, and very middle-of-the-road legislators. There were judges, there were defense attorneys, there were prosecutors, there were victim advocates. And they took testimony from eyewitness memory experts, foremost among whom, or the one they relied on the most was Dr. Gary Wells from Iowa State University. And then the Avery Commission kind of morphed into the Criminal Justice Study Commission, which is sometimes called Innocence Commissions. And again, the composition was the same, and I had the privilege of serving on that commission. And so these three entities came up with a model eyewitness ID procedure. And I was privileged to be part of a team that included the Innocence Project, the Attorney General's Office, Department of Justice. And we traveled around the state and we trained law enforcement in the best practices. Wisconsin actually passed a law requiring every jurisdiction to have an eyewitness identification procedure in place because it was all over the board what people were doing. They did not specify specifically what had to be included in that policy, but because the state came up with one, most jurisdictions decided why reinvent the wheel when they've already done the work for us. I wish more than anything, let me do this after, let me go back to this when we do the Q&A, and I can show you the photos of the two men. But I wish more than anything that I could tell you that this story has a happy ending, much the way Jennifer's did. But unfortunately, it has a very tragic coda. On October 31st, 2005, a young woman named Teresa Hallbach went missing. The last time she was seen was at the Avery Auto Salvage Yard. She had an appointment with Stephen Avery to photograph an auto that his sister had for sale. Teresa's vehicle was found hidden in this auto salvage yard, and Steve's DNA was found in a number of places in her car. and her charred remains were later recovered from a burn barrel on his property. My first reaction, again, my friend Janine Geske called me to tell me the news that Teresa was missing. My first reaction was disbelief. Steve had filed a civil lawsuit because of his wrongful conviction, and depositions were being taken, and I was supposed to be deposed in a couple of weeks around Thanksgiving. And I could have been helpful to him because I knew about the exculpatory evidence that had never been shared, etc. And I thought, why would he jeopardize this lawsuit in doing something so horrendous? Plus, I just couldn't, the cognitive dissonance between the kind person who met with me when I apologized to him and he accepted my apology and was kind and generous, it just didn't add up. However, the more I learned, the more certain I became that Steve was Teresa's murderer. And then in February of 2006, Steve's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, confessed to helping his uncle Ray murder and burn Teresa's body. Both were convicted in individual trials of her murder and are now serving life without the possibility of parole in the state of Wisconsin. The same DNA technology that freed Steve in 2001 helped convict him in 2000, I think it's 2007 he was convicted, 2006 or 7. But I need to say to you that this is highly unusual. Of the 300 plus men and women who've been exonerated by DNA in the United States, Steve was only the second person who has gone on to commit a violent crime. All these exonerees struggle, and they struggle mightily, but most of them really are trying to put their lives back together. Always in the back of my mind is the nagging, unanswerable question: if I had identified the correct person, would Teresa Halbach be alive today? Was Steve so filled with rage over his wrongful conviction, and with me as his female accuser, that he murdered Teresa? The sadness I felt over Steve's wrongful conviction in lost years has been superseded by his atrocity. I did not know Teresa, and I have not met the Halbach family. But I cannot begin to understand or even imagine the magnitude of their loss. They experienced the one horror I have always felt I could not survive: the murder of a child. From their public reaction both at the time of the trial and at Teresa's disappearance, it's clear that they have a very strong, abiding faith. I think of Teresa on an almost daily basis, and I'm haunted by the video diary that she left for her family 3 years before she died. She was a videographer. She had graduated from UW Green Bay, was trying to start her own business, and was working for Auto Trader magazine to supplement her income, which is how her life came to intersect with Steve Mabry's. But she made this video diary 3 years before her murder. She said to her family, if I die young, and I don't think I will, but if I die young, I want you to know I've had a great life, and I felt loved.